You see, countries don't fold because of admiration. They fold when they realize they made a fatal miscalculation. Burkina Faso tried to play the game the Western way, courting China, testing France, pushing India to the sidelines. But here's the catch. They thought India was still in the 1990s. They thought India would plead posture and offer grants in desperation. But what stood before them wasn't that India. It was Jaishankar's India. It was an India that doesn't react emotionally, but calculates like a master surgeon. Cold, precise, unapologetic, Burkina expected a response. What they got was a mirror. India simply stopped talking. No tweets, no summits, no back-channel sweet talk. Just stillness, a silence so suffocating, it felt like isolation. You underestimate India, and India will give you exactly what you ask for, distance, and in geopolitics, distance is death. Because India isn't trying to impress anymore, it's not there to be loved, it's there to lead. And that's exactly what Jaishankar understood. When the world stops hearing from you, it starts fearing what you'll do next. Burkina Faso saw India pull back, and something strange happened. The Chinese didn't fill the gap. France didn't step up. The UN, they just issued another non-binding resolution no one reads. Burkina looked around and realized India had become essential, and no one else could replicate what it brings. What does India bring? Stability without colonization, development without debt traps, military training without occupation, technology without surveillance, in short, respect. And Burkina Faso realized that respect wasn't a commodity. It was a currency. And without India's cooperation, their credit in Africa's new economy of diplomacy, trade, influence was drying up. But here's where it gets colder. India didn't go knocking on Ouagadougou's doors. It waited, and waiting in a world obsessed with instant diplomacy is a psychological weapon. It broke Burkina Faso's confidence. It shattered their illusion of being a regional decider. It made them stare into the abyss and ask, what if India doesn't return? And then it happened. A quiet message, a private call, an invitation for cooperation, not as a gesture of goodwill, but as an act of survival. Burkina Faso folded not because they saw India's strength, but because they felt their own weakness. It's like chess. When the queen is lost and your king is cornered, you don't resign because you're noble. You resign because there's no future left on the board. India didn't threaten Burkina Faso, it outlasted them. And let's be brutally honest, this is a pattern now. African nations, once held hostage by Western economic theories and Chinese exploitation, are now recognizing something fundamental. India isn't coming to rescue them. It's coming to redefine the game, and Burkina Faso just became the first domino to fall publicly, but certainly not the last. Because they weren't brought to their knees by force. They walked to India quietly, shamefully, strategically, because Jaishankar made it clear, India is the axis now. And mark my words, when a country folds in silence, it speaks louder than 1,000 statements. This isn't just a diplomatic shift. It's the sound of history being rewritten with Indian ink. For decades, India played the good friend, the helpful partner, the silent contributor in Africa's post-colonial rebuilding, medical aid here, scholarships there, soft loans wrapped in cultural diplomacy. But friendship, in the world of geopolitics, has an expiration date when power dynamics shift, and shift they did. Today, India is no longer cooperating, it's commanding, not with aggression, not with arrogance, but with undeniable authority born of consistency, delivery, and strength. And the reason Africa is turning its eyes back to New Delhi isn't nostalgia, it's necessity. Let's be very clear. Africa is not a victim. It is a continent filled with potential, hunger, ambition, and youth. But it has been manipulated for too long, first by Europe, then by China, and now cautiously it scans the horizon for someone who doesn't arrive with a leash in one hand and a debt trap in the other. Enter India, not to exploit, not to preach, but to reset the terms. And under Jaishankar, this reset isn't polite. It's clinical. You see, when Burkina Faso shifted its posture, it wasn't an isolated act, it was a signal. Other African nations are watching, and what they are seeing is that India is no longer offering assistance, it's offering alignment. On India's terms, because cooperation is an act of goodwill, command is an act of structure, cooperation allows space for chaos. Command demands order. India isn't helping Africa build hospitals anymore. It's training their doctors to build hospitals themselves. It's not just exporting wheat, it's teaching them how to grow it efficiently. It's not gifting satellites, it's helping them launch their own. That's not charity, that's leadership. Burkina Faso's U-turn happened the moment they realized India had quietly become the most trusted partner with the least to prove and the most to offer. In education, India is training thousands of African students, not just in medicine and engineering, but in governance, cybersecurity, and space technology. In defense, India is no longer just supplying arms, it's building military academies. In diplomacy, Indian embassies aren't just conducting protocol, they're brokering peace in East African corridors that once belonged to American whispers and Chinese checkbooks. Let me give it to you straight. Cooperation is when you're asked to be at the table. Command is when your presence defines the table. India isn't asking anymore, and the world feels it. African leaders now recognize that India's neutrality is not indecision, it's strength. India doesn't pick sides, it builds bridges, it doesn't demand loyalty, it earns respect. And when that respect crosses a critical threshold, it transforms into strategic submission, not forced, but voluntary. Look at how India handled the African energy sector. While the West dictated green mandates and China bombed the continent with overbuilt coal plants, India came in quietly offering hybrid tech, microgrid scalability, and sustainable infrastructure designed not just to impress donors, but to survive Africa's real-world terrain. That's not aid. That's architecture of a new alliance. And this shift from cooperation to command didn't happen overnight. It was years of patient strategy, of surgical strikes in diplomacy, and a refusal to entertain short-term optics. Jaishankar didn't chase headlines, he built foundations. And now, while other nations panic to buy influence, India simply collects respect that it already earned. So when Burkina Faso came knocking again, India didn't rush, it waited, because that's what commanders do. They don't respond to every cry. They wait until the lesson is fully absorbed, until the pain of absence outweighs the comfort of ego. This isn't just a foreign policy win, it's a psychological transformation. Because for the first time, nations like Burkina Faso are starting to understand. India isn't offering partnership to feel good about itself. It's offering leadership because it already knows what it's worth. And when leadership is backed by credibility, discipline, and strength, it stops needing permission. It just moves forward, and the world follows. What we're seeing now is not the rebirth of India-Africa relations. That would be too small. We are witnessing something deeper, a repositioning of moral authority, an awakening of dormant alliances, and a growing realization across the global south that India isn't a participant anymore, it's the pivot. And in Africa, the pivot is now permanent. In a world addicted to noise, press conferences, angry tweets, urgent condemnations, Jaishankar chose the oldest weapon known to the wise, silence. But make no mistake, this silence wasn't passive, it was active, it was deliberate, it was deadly, because true power doesn't need to shout. It only needs to withdraw. When Burkina Faso began leaning too far into the arms of China and France, India didn't scramble for reaction. It didn't issue threats, it didn't beg for meetings or offer more favorable trade terms. No, India simply disappeared from the room. No press, no panic, no performance, just an iron stillness. And that silence, it was deafening. Because here's what the West never understood about real diplomacy. The absence of a powerful nation creates a vacuum more terrifying than its presence ever could. Burkina Faso expected retaliation. They expected an emotional outburst or a desperate attempt to repair ties. They got none. What they got instead was a cold, haunting distance, and with that distance came fear not of attack but of irrelevance. India didn't have to sanction Burkina Faso to cause a ripple. All it had to do was stop answering the phone. Silence, in this context, became psychological warfare. Every delayed response from an Indian official, every unanswered request, every cancelled delegation, it added pressure, it added weight. And in that growing vacuum, Burkina Faso realized something most nations only understand when it's too late. India is no longer optional. It's essential. You see, sanctions are a symptom of desperation, a last move when influence has already been lost. But silence is what you do when your position is so strong, you don't need to explain yourself anymore. And that's exactly what Jaishankar understands. Explanations are for the weak. Presence is for the powerful. Burkina Faso felt that. At first, they laughed it off. India will come back. But days turned to weeks, and India didn't. And something terrifying began to set in. The West wasn't filling the space. China wasn't stepping up either. They were alone, and worse, invisible, because when India pulls back, it doesn't take just its money. It takes its trust. It takes its developmental partnerships, its military training programs, its agricultural support, its satellite data, its moral weight in international forums. And suddenly, the country left behind isn't just isolated, it's directionless. That's what happened in Burkina Faso, a slow collapse not of government but of diplomatic orientation. They couldn't posture toward the West because that bridge is tainted with colonial guilt. They couldn't lean fully into China because every Chinese deal comes with a noose hidden in the contract. And now, with India silent, they had no third option, no moral anchor, no reliable compass. Just the cold realization that they had pushed away the only country that doesn't exploit weakness but punishes arrogance. Jaishankar didn't have to lift a single finger to make this happen. He just stood still, and that stillness exposed everything. Because silence does what sanctions never can. It reveals who needs the relationship more. And when Burkina Faso folded back into India's orbit, they did so not as proud negotiators, but as humbled observers of a man who had no interest in revenge. Only order. This is a new kind of diplomacy, not colonial, not transactional, but psychological. India has mastered the art of walking away with dignity. And that walk-away power has become its greatest weapon, because in international relations, walking away doesn't mean weakness. It means you have better places to be. Burkina Faso forgot that. Jaishankar reminded them, and now others are watching. They see that India doesn't shout, doesn't threaten, doesn't bribe. It simply builds, and if you insult that effort, it quietly exits. And when it exits, you don't just lose an ally, you lose your future. So remember this: the silence of the strong isn't empty. It's filled with consequences, and right now the world is learning. When India goes quiet, you're already too late. We are living through the collapse of an illusion, a world where a few superpowers dictated the fate of many, where freedom was never truly free, and where every aid package came with invisible chains. For decades, African nations were told they had only two choices: kneel to the West or trade your soul to China. But that lie is disintegrating, and what's rising in its place is India, not as a savior but as a sovereign alternative. This is the moment Africa realizes it has a third door, and behind that door is not just trade, not just diplomacy, but something infinitely more valuable: freedom without subjugation. Let's speak plainly. Western involvement in Africa has always come cloaked in moral superiority. The IMF, the World Bank, the EU, all promised upliftment while constructing economic cages. If you wanted help, you had to follow their recommendations, which were never really recommendations. They were orders wrapped in academic language. Then came China, offering infrastructure with no lectures. Sounds better until you read the fine print, until your airports belong to them, until your debt becomes your coffin. So, where does Africa turn now? To the only nation that understands what it means to be colonized without becoming bitter, powerful without becoming predatory, rising without needing to conquer. That nation is India. That voice is Jaishankar's. That path is multipolar freedom. And Burkina Faso just showed the rest of Africa what that shift looks like in real time. They saw what happens when you underestimate India, when you mistake quiet dignity for diplomatic weakness. But they also saw what happens when you return with humility. India doesn't hold grudges. It holds the door open if you're willing to walk in with respect. This is the power of a country that leads by example. India doesn't need to evangelize democracy in Africa. It lives it. It doesn't need to export ideology. It exports infrastructure and education without rewriting your constitution. It doesn't plant flags on your land. It plants ideas in your youth. And that's why the African continent is waking up. Because India is the only global power that treats them not as victims to be saved, but as partners to be empowered. It's the only power that understands what it feels like to be dismissed, underestimated, humiliated, and to rise anyway. That emotional resonance matters. It's why African leaders are now seeking out India not just for trade routes and military cooperation, but for something deeper, a template for self-respect. And here's what makes this even more seismic. India is not offering protection. It's offering independence. You want nuclear energy, India trains your scientists. You want digital revolution, India helps you build sovereign platforms. You want to vote against the UN consensus. India stands beside you and says, make your own decision. That's not alignment. That's liberation. For the first time, African nations can envision a future where they're not puppets on a string, where BRICS isn't just a bloc but a bulwark against neo-imperialism, where South-South cooperation becomes more than a slogan, it becomes the skeleton of a new global system. And India is at the center of it, not because it demanded to be, but because it deserved to be. This is why Burkina Faso's U-turn is more than a headline. It's a prophecy, a preview of what's coming. One by one, African nations will stop looking to Brussels or Beijing. They'll look to Delhi not for rescue, but for respect, not for charity, but for choice. India's rise isn't just changing its own future, it's offering others a chance to rewrite theirs. And if you're not watching that happen in real time, you're missing the most important transformation of our era. Because for the first time in modern history, the nations that were once controlled are becoming the authors of their own chapters. And the ink they're using is made in India. There was a time, not long ago, when India craved validation. From the UN, from Washington, from Davos, from every global forum designed to remind rising nations of their place, India would bend, explain, apologize, and accommodate, hoping, waiting, begging to be seen as an equal. But that India is gone, and with it the West has lost its leverage. You see, the real currency of control was never money. It was approval. The West mastered the art of making nations feel incomplete without a seat at their table. And for decades, India played by those rules, pleasing NATO, pandering to global summits, softening its tone just to be acknowledged. But Jaishankar changed everything. He didn't just reject the game, he redefined the board. He looked the West in the eye and said something no Indian diplomat had dared to say in decades. We don't need your permission to rise. That statement wasn't just political. It was psychological emancipation. It was the moment India stopped asking and started asserting. Because what the West never expected was that one day, a former colony would become too powerful to ignore and too principled to control. And when Burkina Faso came crawling back, it wasn't just an African shift, it was a confirmation that India had broken free of the one chain that truly mattered, the need to be liked. This is what terrifies the old powers. India is no longer shaped by international opinion. It's shaping it. Because when you no longer fear being excluded from their halls, their approval becomes meaningless. When you no longer beg for their investments, their threats become laughable. And when you no longer apologize for your nationalism, your identity becomes your greatest weapon. India has reached that point. Let's be brutally honest. The West used validation as a weapon of silence. They would say, "You're doing well but not enough. You're improving but not fast enough. Good growth, but where are the human rights reports?" Every compliment came with a leash. Every handshake, a hidden clause. And for years, India swallowed that slow poison until it realized the truth. Validation is a leash disguised as praise. Jaishankar tore that leash off with cold clarity. When asked about Western criticism, he didn't blink. He said, "We don't lecture others and we won't accept lectures anymore." That sentence did more damage to Western soft power than any military strike could have. Because it exposed the hollow center of Western diplomacy, moral hypocrisy. They want India's markets, India's tech, India's stability, but not India's voice. And now they're getting the message. You can't have one without the other. India today isn't waiting to be invited to elite clubs. It's building new ones. It's turning BRICS from an acronym into a force. It's forging South-South alliances based on dignity, not debt. It's becoming the economic spine of the global South, not by asking for inclusion, but by becoming indispensable. And this independence is terrifying to those who once controlled through compliments. Because when a country no longer needs your nod to validate its greatness, you lose the only power you had over it. That's where the West stands today, on the sidelines of a new global axis, holding outdated rules, talking about standards no one asked for. Meanwhile, India moves calmly, confidently, relentlessly. The return of Burkina Faso wasn't a win for Jaishankar alone. It was a symbol, a signal to every nation caught between Western fear and Eastern coercion that there is now a third force, a nation that does not bend, does not beg, and does not break. India has found its voice, and more importantly, it no longer needs theirs, so when the West criticizes, India listens, but it does not change. When the West warns, India smiles, but it does not slow down, and when the West tries to isolate India, they realize India has already outgrown the cage. This is not rebellion, this is release, this is not arrogance, this is arrival, and the moment the world sees India for what it has become, not a rising power, but a risen one, the old game ends. And a new world begins.